Okay, is it good morning still or good afternoon? Good afternoon. I am Adela Pineda Franco. I'm the director of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and it is our deep pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Pablo Mijangos y González, who is here as a special guest from Estudios Mexicanos, Mexican Studies, a journal, probably the most important journal on Mexican studies in the US, whose editor-in-chief, main editor, is Professor Matthew Butler. The journal is housed at the University of California, but now Matthew being the editor, we are collaborating with this exciting project. Let me say a little bit about Estudios Mexicanos. Celebrates cutting-edge research relating to Mexico, broadly defined with an annual lecture. Okay, typically held in the fall, this annual lecture serves to showcase new or ongoing research of a distinguished Mexicanist working in the humanities and social sciences, as well as to encourage scholarly dialogue between Mexicanists working inside and outside of Mexico. Lecturers may be nominated in any of the disciplines published by this journal to date. Speakers have worked in the fields of ethnohistory, cultural and media studies, linguistics, and history. Previous speakers have been Kevin Terraciano, Paul Julian Smith, Victor Zúñiga, and Tatiana Klein, and John Tutino. We are so happy too because this is a very interdisciplinary enterprise about Mexico. So today we will listen to Pablo Mijangos y González talk. He is the Edmund J and Louise W. Kahn Chair in History at Southern Methodist University since August 2023. He received his bachelor's in law in Mexico in 2001 and his PhD in history at UT Austin. So we are very proud of him. So our alum. After his graduation, he joined the faculty of the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, CIDE, one of the leading public research centers for social science and in the humanities in Mexico. He stayed there for 14 years, becoming a level 3 member of Mexico's National System of Researchers.
Level 2.
Level 2, okay. Es el SNI, el famoso SNI. And serving as chair of the History Department between 2020 and 2022. He has published 5 books and 6 edited volumes, and he also directs a book series, Legal History of Latin America, published by the Spanish press Tarantlo Blanche, now numbering over 20 titles. In 2024, Mexico's Judiciary TV channel aired a 9-chapter documentary series based on his book Historia Mínima de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de México, which you can all see on YouTube. Also in that year, he was appointed as an international corresponding member of the Mexican Academy of History, which is a high honor in Mexico. He's currently working on the history of concordats in post-colonial Latin America between the 1820s and 1878. By examining the negotiation and agreements between the papacy and the different republics that emerged after independence, Professor Mijangos aims to reinterpret the transformations of Catholicism in the region throughout the 19th century and the influence of these religious developments on state-building processes. Since the larger policy of the Holy See for the Americas can only be appreciated through a comparative and transnational approach, this project also emphasizes an understanding of Latin America as a true continental region, rather than a collection of separate national histories.
Okay, well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this lecture on Friday at 2 p.m. I really appreciate that. And also, well, it's always a big honor, a big joy for me to be here at UT, which is my alma mater. I was trained here as a historian, so I'm more than happy to come here anytime. And well, I want to thank first of all Adela and Paloma from the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, as well as my colleague and friend Matthew Butler for inviting me today. So, well, if I were giving this lecture in Spanish, I probably would not use my notes, but in English, I prefer to follow what I wrote before. So, when Matthew invited me to give this lecture for one of the most important journals in the discipline, Mexican Studies, Estudios Mexicanos, I took it as an invitation to talk about my research, but also as an opportunity to share my view about some possible paths for the field in the near future. Having completed my PhD in this university, worked in Mexico for 14 years, and then returned to the US a couple of years ago, I can confidently say that Mexican historiography has reached a level of maturity, sophistication, and diversity that puts it on a par with any of the major historiographies of the Western world. Anglophone scholarship on Mexico continues producing significant, path-breaking works, as it has always done. Still, most of the new Mexican past, borrowing the expression of Enrique Florescano, remember this book, El Nuevo Pasado Mexicano, most of this new Mexican past is actually being written in Mexico by a growing network of universities and research centers that have expanded our historiographical frontiers in a way that was not even imaginable a couple of decades ago. It is incredibly challenging to find a relevant topic or region that has not been explored or is not being explored as we speak. I could mention 10 or more subjects that still need their historian, but I don't want to waste your time listening to my opinions on the books that I would like to read someday. Rather, and echoing again my experience on both sides of the border, I want to insist on what I think is the most urgent challenge or the most promising opportunity, let me rephrase it, the most promising opportunity for the field. We still have to do much more to transcend the national boundaries that have framed the discipline since its inception and deepen our understanding of Mexico's place in the world and the continent. We need to read and learn more from other national histories. We need more comparative, transnational, supranational, and international studies, and a better understanding of both the commonalities and distinctive aspects of Mexico within that entity we call Latin America. We Mexicans love to believe that como México no hay dos, a friendly version of the jingoist exceptionalism that is currently in vogue in the US. But the truth is that we have more in common with each other than we would like to admit. And it is usually easier to realize that when we look at Mexico from afar and in connection with supranational realities, we can better understand that we are not as exceptional as we believe, even if we may have a distinctive history. As my dear advisor Mauricio Tenorio liked to say, we need to see Mexico con ojos más que mexicanos, with eyes that look beyond the Mexican perspective. In this talk, I aim to demonstrate the usefulness and necessity of a comparative and supranational approach to Mexican history by sharing some interesting discoveries from my own research. As some of you may know, one of the topics that has caught my attention most is the separation of church and state in the middle decades of the 19th century. Why did Mexico, one of the most Catholic countries of the continent, undertake one of the most radical experiments in state-driven secularization barely half a century after independence? I first addressed this topic in my dissertation and later book on the ideology of the Mexican higher clergy at the time of the Reforma, and then in a series of works about the institutional experience of the confessional regime that existed in Mexico until 1859. One of the questions that then puzzled me and that I could not answer by looking exclusively to Mexico was why Mexico did not follow the path that actually prevailed in the rest of the continent, where the union of church and state was the rule until the end of the century. What was distinctive about Mexico when compared with the rest of Spanish America? Fortunately for me, the topic I was studying provided a massive clue that, for different reasons, had not been thoroughly explored by most of my colleagues in Mexico and the US. Mexico was a predominantly Catholic country, which means that its hegemonic religious denomination forms part of a truly global community of believers, coordinated and led, at least in its most complicated issues, by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. What role did the Holy See play in the Mexican drama of the mid-19th century? How did Rome see Mexico, and how did that vision shape its decisions about the country? After some years of research in the Vatican archives, I finally began to understand that from the vantage point of Rome, Mexico was never seen as an island detached from the rest of the continent. Rather, it was part of what papal officials called La América Española, Spanish America, a group of troubled republics that emerged out of the Atlantic revolutions and the fragmentation of the Spanish Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. For Rome, the primary problem of that group was that the central institution that had presided over the development of the Catholic Church in that part of the world since the 16th century, the royal patronage of the Spanish crown, it had ceased to exist with independence, leaving those churches at the expense of republican governments that were usually led by ostensibly anti-clerical politicians and who expected to continue managing the religious affairs and clerical wealth of their own countries. Let me make three important clarifications here. First, I insist on the Spanish and not Latin character of this part of the Americas, as Rome clearly understood that Brazil and Haiti came from different imperial and ecclesiastical traditions, thus requiring tailor-made policies adjusted to their specific histories. It was only after the 1860s that Rome began to use the concept of Latin America more frequently, but that is a different story that I will not address here. We can talk about it at the end of the talk if you want. Second, when I talk about Rome, I refer to the central governing institutions of the Catholic Church, the Pope and the so-called Roman Curia, which encompasses a series of bodies and congregations with different tasks and jurisdictions. When dealing with church-state relations, the two key institutions were the Secretariat of State and its network of diplomatic envoys, and especially their advisory body, the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, a board of cardinals and highly skilled officials created in 1814 to deal with the extraordinary problems created by the revolutionary storm that swept Catholic Europe since 1789. As it could be expected, we are talking about a professional class of clerics, most of them born and raised in the Italian peninsula, and whose rather reactionary worldview was shaped by the recent experience of the Catholic Church in Europe during the Napoleonic era and the Restoration, that is, during the pontificates of Pius VII, Leo XII, Pius VIII, and Gregory XVI. When referring to this institutional and social universe, I will make reference to those bodies or to Rome or to the Holy See and not to the Vatican, which is a common but imprecise expression since what we know today as the Vatican City State was only born in 1929. And third, by patronage, a word that you will hear a lot in this talk, I mean not only the right of the state to present candidates to vacant ecclesiastical offices, but a series of wide-ranging powers related to the government and administration of the Catholic Church, from the collection and distribution of tithes to the establishment of new dioceses, the sustenance of the clergy, the supervision of clerical education, the delimitation of ecclesiastical courts' jurisdiction, and the review of disciplinary church decisions by civil courts, among others. Even if those powers seem to affect only the clergy and the church, they have major ramifications in all key areas of state building, especially local governance, education, family law, the legal regime of private property, the public treasury, and even national identity. This is why the patronage question was always treated as a truly constitutional issue, heavily regulated by law and addressed by practically all of the annual reports of Spanish American governments throughout the century. This being said, in this presentation, I want to explain what was distinctive or peculiar about Mexico within Spanish America, using as my primary source such Roman documents as the instructions of the Secretary of State to his diplomatic envoys and executive reports on Spanish American issues prepared for the meetings of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs. By examining Mexico from a Roman perspective, and therefore with a comparative point of view, because this congregation was always making comparisons, I aim to understand why, at the time of the First Vatican Council, 1870, Mexico was the only country in Spanish America where the old institution of patronage had disappeared for good. Colombia would be the other case, but we have to remember that despite the separation of church and state, government intervention in church affairs returned in disguise in 1861 and then was fully restored with the Concordat of 1888. As we can see in this table here, by 1870, most Spanish American governments continued exercising patronage rights either with the formal consent of Rome or in an irregular way by force of habit. Let me begin the comparative analysis I've just outlined by addressing a common explanation for the variations in the church-state relationship across the different Spanish American republics in the 19th century. According to the late historian John Lynch, there were diverse factors accounting for those variations, from the contrasting experiences of state building to the character of particular governments or caudillos. However, he believed that the most important factor, and I quote here, was, quote, the relative power and wealth of the Catholic Church. Where the church was large, in clergy and resources, it was more likely to provoke anti-clericalism and envy, both political and personal. It was also in a stronger position to defend itself. Where the church was poor and weak, it did not provoke overt hostility, but nor could it defend itself, and gradually, without a dramatic conflict, it would find its privileges eroded. End of the quote. This explanation makes sense to some extent. Conflict would be more bitter and loss more radical where there was more at stake in terms of ecclesiastical wealth and social influence of the clergy. Or so it seems. However, this correlation does not necessarily hold water. Let me assess this thesis with the information from L'Orbe Cattolico, the monumental geographical and ecclesiastical atlas compiled by the Secretariat of State of the Holy See between 1858 and 1859. What we can see here is that the two Spanish American republics that had experienced church-state separation in the mid-19th century, Mexico and Colombia, were indeed the largest in terms of population, dioceses, and parishes. Both countries were the seat of 21 dioceses and home to 43% of the parishes in the entire region. However, the correlation between size and the intensity of conflict does not work for the third country in the list, Peru, where despite the church's wealth and the existence of a strong anti-clerical tradition, church-state tensions did not result in a complete breakup, but rather in the papal concession of patronage rights to the Peruvian government in 1874. In the same vein, the small Central American republics were the setting for the most dramatic church-state conflict in the 1820s, the so-called Schism of El Salvador, and also a very auspicious ground for concordat negotiations with Rome between 1852 and 1862. Not to mention the peculiar case of Paraguay, whose rather small church was completely controlled by the state until the end of the War of the Triple Alliance in 1870. At the end of this conflict, one bishop, the highest religious authority of the country, was executed under the charge of treason, something unthinkable in Mexico or Colombia. Thus, size did matter, but not as much as Lynch's statement would suggest. Then, if not the size of its church, what factors can help us better understand the distinctive path of Mexico? If we look at the instructions to the first apostolic delegate in Mexico, signed in 1851, and the executive reports prepared for the major meetings on Mexican issues of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs in 1845, 1847, 1856, 1857, and 1864, that is, during a 20-year period of extreme political turbulence, it is easy to discern a relatively stable assessment about the structural peculiarities of Mexico, centered on four major factors: its early experience of church-state conflict after independence, the condition and prevailing loyalties of the higher clergy, the profound religiosity of the Mexican people, and the extreme fragility and unreliability of its secular government. That assessment, read against the backdrop of the simultaneous issues with other Spanish American republics, would influence the most important papal decisions on the country, discourage any moderate approach, and push the conflict toward total separation. Let me examine them one by one. The early experience of church-state conflict. Both in 1851 and 1864, that is before and after the liberal reform, the Secretariat of State considered that the damage the revolution has done to this unfortunate nation has been greatly less than that suffered by the other republics of South America. I'm quoting here verbatim the Secretariat of State. It is striking that papal officers kept repeating this idea with almost identical wording, even after the dramatic breakup between church and state in 1859. However, this makes sense in light of the dramatic upheavals that most Spanish American churches experienced during the first 2 decades after independence. It is not an accident that the Congregation of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs devoted more sessions to Spanish America between 1823 and 1846 than during the first 2 decades of the long pontificate of Pope Pius IX, who certainly showed a stronger interest in the region than his predecessors. Leaving aside the thorny issue of the formal recognition of independence, which was essentially resolved with the death of Ferdinand VII in 1833, the Roman view of Spanish America was shaped during the pontificates of Leo XII, Pius VIII, and Gregory XVI by an avalanche of alarming reports from Central and South America. For the papal officers of the 1850s, who learned about the region from the institutional memory crafted by their predecessors, Spanish America was synonymous with godless governments assuming patronage powers without Roman approval, unacceptable constitutional oaths, local churches bitterly divided over the legitimacy of their authorities, bishops banned from their diocesan territories, and sweeping reforms that wiped out clerical wealth on a massive scale. All of this in the middle of a significant decline of religious vocations and widespread dissemination of impious ideas through education and public opinion. It is true that the Mexican experience, especially after 1855, was not entirely distant from this general pattern, but it had some distinctive peculiarities. In the first place, the 2 most serious attempts to deny the supremacy of Rome during the 1820s and 1830s had failed. First, the draft of instructions for a Mexican envoy in Rome, which was considered by the papal court as full of schismatic tendencies. And second, and most important, the ambitious liberal reform of Valentin Gómez Farías here in 1833-34, whose only surviving measure was the suppression of the civil enforcement of the tithe that was maintained until 1859. Even if Mexican constitutions preserved the loathed governmental review of all communications between the local church and Rome, the truth was that the exercise of patronage rights in Mexico had been relatively moderate for Spanish American standards, to the point that the local clergy had a significant influence in the appointment of bishops. According to Mexican law, indeed, the president could not freely propose any loyal cleric for an episcopal position, but instead had to choose a candidate from a list of 3 independently elaborated chosen candidates chosen by the cathedral chapter in question. What all of this meant was that, thanks to the failure of early liberal reforms and the significant degree of autonomy that it managed to preserve, the Mexican clergy faced the storm of the 1850s from a position of relative strength and cohesion that most churches on the continent did not enjoy. Second, the clergy. For evident reasons, one of the key concerns of the Roman Curia when dealing with the Spanish-American countries was the size, quality, and reliability of their clergy, especially considering that most of those churches had been deprived of bishops for a decade or more. Any Roman attempt to reform, protect, and expand Catholic practice on the continent required first and foremost the collaboration of the local clergy, whose primary loyalties were never taken for granted. Thus, both in confidential reports from informants and in the more formalized documents elaborated by the Secretariat of State, it is easy to notice a permanent anxiety over the insufficient number and poor formation of the clergy, the suspicious political affinities of bishops appointed by anti-clerical governments, the prevailing regalist tendencies among the candidates for high clerical office, and the questionable decisions of prelates who took transcendental decisions without even waiting for the green light from Rome. To put one among dozens of similar examples, in the instructions to Monsignor Marino Marini as apostolic delegate for the Argentine Confederation, signed in 1857, the Secretariat of State openly acknowledged that the Argentinian clergy was bad, malo, cattivo. To a large extent because the Bishop of Buenos Aires between 1830 and 1851, Mariano Medrano, had promoted, I'm quoting here, had promoted young men to the sacred orders without any preparation in studies, without ecclesiastical spirit, without information, and without examination. Since there was not even a seminary in Buenos Aires, the instruction added, and I quote again, young clerics attended the schools of the Franciscans and Dominicans for their first letters, where teaching is methodless and examples of cloistered virtue are lacking. For the sciences, they go to the non-canonically established university, where they learn many doctrines that are either erroneous or ultra-Gallican. End of the quote. Similar assessments were made for other countries, pointing to a systemic crisis inherited from colonial times and aggravated as a result of the anti-clerical reforms passed during the early years of Republican life. If there was a trait in the eyes of Rome that distinguished the Mexican Church from others in Spanish America, it was the comparatively good information and ultramontane loyalties of its higher clergy. In 1847, for instance, the Congregation of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs asserted that, at present, the Mexican episcopate is good, and the bishops of Yucatan, Michoacán, and Puebla are especially worthy of praise. Almost 20 years later, in 1864, the same congregation observed that the Mexican Church was in better shape than others because of the pastoral zeal and influence of the bishops and the instruction and temperance of a large sector of the clergy. The congregation did not explicitly analyze the factors that explain the difference, and it is clear that for many years Rome was in the dark regarding the authors and doctrines commonly taught in Mexican seminaries. However, the moderate exercise of patronage I mentioned before, which allowed for the participation of cathedral chapters in the appointment of bishops, and a noticeable tradition of clerical independence are two factors constantly mentioned in Roman documents. Indeed, the Mexican clergy had an outstanding record of setting limits to the regalist or schismatic tendencies of their governments. In 1821, an ecclesiastical board had declared the ending of patronage with independence. In 1825, cathedral chapters had lobbied Congress to prevent a total breakup of relations with Rome. In 1833 and 1847, the bishops had successfully stopped the reforms of Valentín Gómez Farías. And between 1855 and 1861, the Mexican bishops, especially the younger ones like Clemente Jesús Munguía and Pelagio Labastida, had fervently opposed the liberal revolution. If these examples were not enough, the first apostolic delegate in Mexico, Luigi Clementi, reported in 1853 that the Mexican bishops absolutely refused to replace the tithe with salaries paid by the state, for they would rather prefer to beg door to door with their clergy rather than become dependents of a check that, in any case, would never be paid. True, not everything was perfect in the Mexican church. In many places, the number of priests was small compared to the population size and the vastness of the parishes, leading to insufficient attention to the spiritual needs of the faithful. The clergy of the capital, for instance, was generally praised, but the qualities and conduct of some priests and vicars were deplored, as many of them were taken from the lower classes and were so ignorant, and I quote, that they could barely read Latin. There were also far too many widowers with children who were not really fit for the priesthood and yet were promoted to holy orders. More worryingly, the combined effect of wars, political instability, economic decline, and the governmental assault on clerical wealth had resulted in a generalized state of poverty among the clergy, which in turn led to an increasing scarcity of seminarians, as many young men did not want to join the clerical ranks because the church did not offer sufficient means to live. And last but not least, the condition of the regular orders in Mexico was absolutely deplorable. In contrast with their 16th century predecessors, the Mexican friars had become the object of ridicule and scandal because of their licentious life and other disorders. Thus, even if the Mexican church shared most of the problems of its sister churches in Spanish America, the big difference for Rome was that in any case it could count on the bishops to undertake the necessary reforms, provided that they would faithfully collaborate with the representatives sent by Rome, like the aforementioned Luigi Clementi or the nuncio to Maximilian's court, Francesco Meglia. There are many examples of the special trust that Pius IX placed on Mexican bishops, such as the powers that the Pope granted them to reform the religious orders or discretionally negotiate settlements with the purchasers of clerical wealth, not to mention that the first Spanish-American cardinal was a Mexican bishop, Cayetano Gómez de Portugal from Michoacán, who unfortunately passed away before receiving news of this immense honor. For me, one of the most interesting examples is that in all of the concordat negotiations in the region, only in Mexico did the Roman Curia consult and take very seriously the opinion of the Mexican bishops. In all of the other cases, bishops did not participate, or if they did, it was as direct representatives or intermediaries in service of their governments, which was not the best recommendation for Rome. Quite predictably, though, this also meant that the interest in and political affinities of the Mexican episcopate largely influenced Roman policy toward Mexico. There's a saying very common in Mexico, lo que de Roma viene, a Roma va. Third, the people. In general terms, the Holy See was much better informed about the realities and dealings of the Spanish-American clergy than about the actual experiences of the faithful. When describing a continent marked by a long history of colonization, regional, ethnic, and racial diversity, and profound socioeconomic inequalities, Roman sources painted broad strokes with an evident tone of European condescension toward noble but immature American peoples. Mexico was no exception in this regard. In the 1851 instructions to Delegate Clementi, for instance, the Secretary of State asserted that the Mexicans combined the gentleness and docility of their character with extreme sensitivity, like all inhabitants of the tropics, and therefore it is appropriate to treat them with kindness and moderate severity. This character means that Mexicans are not dominated by certain vices, such as obstinacy and cruelty, but they are not constant in their intentions. End of the quote. Nevertheless, after describing Mexicans as perpetual teenagers in need of firm guidance, the instruction emphasized one of their most remarkable virtues. And I quote, "The Mexican people remain firm and constant in the true faith, despite the propensity of Indians toward superstition, the North American efforts to spread Protestant propaganda, and the generalized ignorance of religious matters." 19th century papal officers would have subscribed indeed to the famous phrase repeated by John Paul II in his numerous visits to the country, "México siempre fiel," Mexico ever faithful. The belief that Mexicans were Catholic to the core reflected not only the absolute sociological certainties of the Mexican clergy, but also the continuing influence of the proudly Catholic patriotism developed at the end of the 18th century by such Creole authors as Antonio de León y Gama and Francisco Javier Clavijero. Citing both of them as references, the authoritative Dizionario di Erudizione Storico-Ecclesiastica, compiled by Gaetano Moroni, one of the closest assistants of Pope Pius IX, described the Mexican capital as the holy city of the New World, due to its impressive number of churches, chapels, convents, and monasteries, as well as the magnificence of its religious ceremonies, which were only comparable to those of Rome. Mexico City, indeed, was home to the famous shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which attracted thousands of pilgrims from all over the country. Despite the reassurances provided by popular religiosity, however, Roman officials were worried about the future of Mexican Catholicism for three main reasons. First, the already mentioned scarcity of priests and diocesan structures in large swaths of the country, which left many people without regular access to sacraments and sound doctrine. As Delegate Clementi noted in 1853, the United States and Ireland were in a better situation despite having a much smaller number of Catholics. Second, the social anger at exorbitant parish fees, the obenciones parroquiales, which forced many poor people to live and die in scandalous and reprehensible concubinage, or to carry their dead to the grave themselves without any honor or burial. Delegate Clementi should have quoted here Melchor Ocampo. He was plagiarizing Ocampo without acknowledging him. And third, the efforts of modern progressive atheists to introduce religious toleration, a danger exacerbated by the proximity and power of the United States. Fourth and final factor, the government. Having described Mexicans as pious but immature people, it is not surprising that Roman officials looked at the colonial regime with some nostalgia. In 1864, for instance, the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs asserted as a fact that during the period of Spanish rule, Mexico always appeared to be a well-ordered society, an eminently Catholic, moderate, and peaceful nation that possessed all the assets to which a strong and opulent state could aspire. Displaying their deep-seated anxieties over the contemporary political transformations in the Italian peninsula, both in 1851 and 1864, papal officers argued that Mexico's independence had been the product of a nefarious revolution promoted by secret societies, which sought to destroy the thrones to suppress the Catholic religion. Even if those officers acknowledged the mismanagement and abuses of the old viceregal government and the intolerable colonial status that Spanish Americans had to endure, they emphasized that seditious Mexicans, and I quote, owe their victory to the support of England and the United States, two Protestant countries with different political interests but with a shared aversion to Catholicism. Clearly, that conspiracy had failed in changing the pious heart of Mexicans. They just told us that they were Catholic to the core. But the conspiracy had absolutely succeeded in creating weak, unstable, and completely unreliable governments. For the Roman court of Pius IX, revolution and democracy were almost interchangeable concepts, and both carried a very negative connotation. For Mexico, and for most Spanish American nations, the first 3 decades of Republican rule had been characterized by the frequent change of constitutions, the constitutional succession of parties, the continuous succession of parties, the constant quarrels among ambitious generals over controlling the executive branch, the dissemination of impious ideas under the guise of freedom of the press, and the growing demoralization of society. Therefore, it was undeniable that the intrinsic weakness and democratic character of Republican governments had resulted in the slackening of all the bonds that hold society together. Even though this problem was shared by all the Spanish American republics born with the Atlantic revolutions, the case of Mexico seemed especially troubling because of its proximity to the United States, which conquered a significant part of the northern states in 1847, and the seeming incapacity of Mexicans for republican self-government. Whereas in other countries, the Holy See could place its trust in Catholic strongmen with a demonstrated capacity of taming legislative assemblies and putting their houses in order, caudillos such as Rafael Carrera of Guatemala and Gabriel García Moreno of Ecuador, in the case of Mexico, not even the most conservative generals were entirely trustworthy. Not surprisingly, the papal court became particularly receptive to the monarchist projects of José María Gutiérrez de Estrada, who was one of the most active and influential informants of the Holy See during the pontificate of Pius IX. Let me recapitulate and combine all the elements of the Roman assessment of Republican Mexico. Faced with a country whose Republican government was a total disaster, but whose people was completely Catholic and whose church had better resisted the worst attacks of democracy, to a large extent thanks to the autonomy and traditional independence of its clergy, the papal court would adopt a remarkably intransigent attitude that did not show with most nations of the continent. Listening to the advice of Gutierrez de Estrada, as well as to the rather biased reports of the apostolic delegate Clementi and of such ultramontane bishops as Pelagio Labastida and Clemente Jesus Munguia, the papal court played a very risky game in Mexico, hoping to maximize the power of the Holy See and the autonomy of the Mexican Church in exchange for minimal concessions to the secular governments, regardless of the party in power. As I will show in a moment, this strategy directly contributed to put Mexico in the path of an absolute separation of church and state, which would become irreversible after 1867. For the sake of brevity, I will only mention 4 moments in which the intransigence of the Holy See made it very difficult for Mexican governments to negotiate a peaceful settlement to their religious question. The first one took place in 1851, when, following the plans of Gutierrez de Estrada, the Secretariat of State decided to appoint an apostolic delegate to Mexico without having obtained the approval or even consulted the Mexican government first. The practice of sending diplomatic envoys, some with the character of mere delegates and others with the full powers of nuncio, was not new in Spanish America. After the establishment of an apostolic delegation with an impossible continental mission in Brazil in 1829, the Holy See had appointed a nuncio in Colombia in 1836, and in 1851 it decided to also send delegates to Argentina and Mexico. As Madalena Burelli has observed, the case of the apostolic delegate in Mexico was the first in which the Roman Curia sent its own representative to Spanish America against the wishes of the national government. Mexican President Mariano Arista did not want a papal representative because its jurisdiction would possibly overlap with that of the Mexican bishops, and also because the Liberal Party resented the presence of a foreign authority exercising significant powers in the national territory. For Rome, however, imposing this decision was a way to assert the universality of its jurisdiction and show its proximity to Mexican Catholics, regardless of the opinion of the secular authority. Predictably, when the delegate arrived in Mexico, Congress refused to approve its diplomatic mission, and the Archbishop of Mexico himself did not dare to intervene on his behalf. The resulting impasse lasted for 2 years until interim President Lombardini allowed the delegate to exercise only a limited number of the faculties that the original papal appointment granted him. The second and perhaps most transcendental moment was the negotiation of a concordat under the dictatorial government of Antonio López de Santa Anna, which started in 1853. The negotiation of a concordat, or a comprehensive formal agreement between the national government and the Holy See, in which the patronage question and the major points of conflict between church and state could be resolved permanently, had been an almost obsessive goal of all Spanish American governments since the 1820s. For nearly 3 decades, Rome refused to negotiate concordats because it was too risky to offer concessions to extremely unstable governments, and also because whatever was offered to one country would be immediately requested by the others. In 1848, however, Chile managed to start a concordat negotiation, but with no success. In the end, it was General Andrés de Santa Cruz, as plenipotentiary representative of Bolivia, who achieved the feat of signing the first Spanish-American concordat with Rome in 1851, only to see it rejected by the Bolivian National Assembly at the end of that year. For the Congregation of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, which in practice conducted the negotiations on behalf of the Secretary of State, the Bolivian agreement condensed all the possible concessions of Rome to the Spanish-American governments. It was therefore to become its general template for the entire region, regardless of the peculiarities and specific interests of each country. After the Bolivian failure, the Holy See scored 2 consecutive victories by imposing this model on Guatemala and Costa Rica in 1852. When the dictatorship of Antonio López de Santana started its negotiation with Rome in 1853, the possibility of a lasting solution to the church-state problems in Mexico seemed closer than ever before. Conservatives ruled the country, and with Congress dissolved, the main political obstacles to an agreement had disappeared. Nevertheless, despite this window of opportunity, Rome insisted on imposing the Bolivian model and also took into consideration the opinion of the Mexican bishops, most of whom were contrary to granting any significant concession to what they saw as an essentially anarchical government. Why was the Bolivian model so problematic for Mexico? Essentially because it required granting the Mexican church full control over the national education system, the power to censor all publications dealing with moral or religious issues, the possibility of enforcing papal bulls or decrees without previous authorization from the state, the financing of the clergy at the expense of the public treasury, and the total protection of its patrimony, all in exchange of giving the government the same powers it already exercises in the appointment of bishops, and of reducing the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts. The end of the ecclesiastical fuero was the only significant concession of the Concordat project. Believing that it could deal with Mexico as it had done with Guatemala and Costa Rica, Rome not only underestimated the institutional ambitions of the Mexican government, and especially its interest in modernizing the education system to foster development, but also expected financial concessions that the country was in no condition to offer after the Mexican-American War. Yet again, Rome's maximalist position bogged down the negotiations and closed the last realistic opportunity for a lasting agreement. After the fall of Santa Anna and the end of Concordat negotiations in the summer of 1855, the liberal revolution led by Juan Álvarez and then by Ignacio Comonfort passed a series of anti-clerical decrees that dramatically reduced the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts, forced the clergy to sell its real estate, established a civil registry to supervise the actions of parish priests, and forbade them to charge fees to the poor for the performance of religious services. The key element of the liberal anti-clerical offensive was the 1857 Constitution, whose original text was silent on the religious identity of the nation and yet granted the federal government a broad power to intervene in the administration of church affairs. It was a unilateral assumption of patronage over the church without the consent of the Holy See. As it is well known, Mexican bishops resisted these measures in the most confrontative way possible, to the point that they threatened excommunication for any public officer who took an oath of allegiance to the new constitution. Even if the cascade of liberal decrees and episcopal responses followed a polarizing logic of its own, Rome had a decisive role in the unfolding of the crisis. Based on the reports that describe the situation in Mexico in the most negative light, suggesting that the liberal government was on the verge of collapse and did not have any real support among the people, Pope Pius IX pronounced an incendiary allocution on December 15, 1856, Nunquam Fore, in which he declared absolutely null and void the anti-clerical decrees of the liberal government, while praising the most radical bishops for their intransigent attitude. President Comonfort attempted to start a negotiation in 1857, but Bishop Pelagio Labastida, by then in exile in Rome, managed to convince the Secretariat of State that no member of the liberal establishment deserved the trust of the Pope. One of the most fascinating documents I've ever seen in my life is a list of who was who in Mexico in 1857, made by Pelagio Labastida, a list of 50 or 60 people, describing, their frailties and problems, both liberals and conservatives, saying, this is a drunkard, this one is a cheater, this one is so corrupt, this is an idiot. But the conclusion was that no one was reliable. The only one was Lucas Salaman, but he unfortunately had died in 1853. So the war between church and state was irreversible and explicit. The national crisis over the constitutional oath, which provoked dozens of revolts and other actions of social resistance across the central western axis of the country, paved the way for the military coup of December 1857 and the outbreak of a true civil war between liberals and conservatives in January 1858. It was in the context of that conflict that between July 1859 and December 1860, President Benito Juárez proclaimed the most perfect independence between church and state, but also declaring that all clerical wealth now belonged to the nation. Even if this dramatic decision meant that the Mexican government renounced its patronage powers over the church, thus breaking with a tradition that had started in the 16th century, it was not the first case of a full separation of church-state in Spanish America. Already in 1853, and as a consequence of a polarizing conflict not very different from that of Mexico, in which Pius IX had also intervened with heavy hand, the Colombian government had separated church and state in the most absolute terms. This precedent is important because it allowed the Holy See to evaluate for the first time in Spanish America how would ecclesiastical affairs work without any intervention from civil authorities. And the Colombian experience was initially positive. As the apostolic delegates in that country recognized, the regime of separation gave the church full liberty in its pastoral work and allowed Rome to freely appoint the most ultramontane bishops. This experiment, however, ended in 1861, when after the violent expulsion of delegate Ledochovsky, the delegate of Rome in Colombia, General Tomás Mosquera reintroduced patronage powers in disguise by ordering that no cleric could exercise his religious duties without explicit approval from the state, the so-called right of tuition, a creation of the Colombians. No other country had such a thing. The Colombian case is relevant because it taught a hard lesson to Rome. Even if Catholic doctrine instructed that civil and religious authorities should work together as one in Catholic countries, in practical terms, it was preferable a separation with full liberty for the clergy to an oppressive regime of patronage and state control over the church. The Pope would have to choose again between the two extremes when the project of establishing a European protectorate in Mexico was finally brought into being by the French intervention of 1862, which imposed a Mexican Second Empire ruled by an Austrian prince of the Habsburg dynasty. Even if the Pope himself had personally blessed Maximilian and Charlotte on their way to their new throne, the Holy See did not change its extremely intransigent attitude toward Mexico. Thus, after Maximilian ratified the liberal nationalization of clerical wealth and the introduction of religious tolerance, and then suggested the possibility of negotiating a concordat that granted wide-ranging patronage powers to the empire, the Secretariat of State protested and eventually decided to withdraw its diplomatic mission in Mexico in May 1865. Why the papal animosity toward an Austrian Catholic emperor, a really good guy actually, that seemingly offered the best hopes for the restoration of good relations between church and state? Besides the intrigues of the then exiled Archbishop of Michoacán, Clemente Jesus Munguia, who explicitly compared in favorable terms the liberal separation of church and state to Maximilian's proposals, the Congregation of Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs had already noticed the same phenomenon that previously took place in Colombia. The regime of separation had allowed the Pope to undertake an ambitious reorganization of the Catholic Church in Mexico, exclusively relying on the advice and intervention of the bishops. In 1862, indeed, Pius IX had created 7 new dioceses out of the fragmentation of the existing ones, which meant 7 new bishops and seminaries to facilitate the increase of the clergy, all without consulting the secular government. Why would Rome sacrifice such liberty for an Austrian prince that, in any case, ruled over a bankrupt empire that lacked popular support and even an army of its own? Considering the available alternatives, all of which involved some degree of state intervention, the Holy See preferred to leave the largest church of Spanish America on its own, protected by its newly acquired legal independence. It was the dawn of a different era. Let me finish with a couple of concluding remarks. As I hope to have demonstrated, the Roman assessment of the peculiarities of Mexico within the Spanish American context, as well as the decisions that the Secretariat of State and Pope Pius IX took on the basis of such assessment, had a direct impact in the sequence of events that led to the separation of church and state in 1859, and its consolidation with the definitive victory of the liberal government in 1867. With this argument, I do not want to suggest that other domestic factors or institutions were less relevant to the path to separation, or in the outbreak and development of the civil war between liberals and conservatives. But I do want to emphasize that the final outcome cannot be explained without taking into account the decisive role of a global institution, the Holy See, that interacted with Mexico based on a larger evaluation of the entire Spanish-American region. Mexico has a distinctive history, but it has never been an island detached from the rest of the world that can be understood only with national sources and perspectives. To fully understand this history, we also need to look at it from abroad, taking into consideration the differences and similarities with parallel histories and with ojos más que mexicanos. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you so much, Pablo, for that fascinating and wide-ranging talk, and your apology for a broader perspective on Mexican history. We have time for a few questions, so if there are any questions, then please do go ahead and raise your hand.
Your name?
Pablo Mijangos.
Pablo what?
Mijangos.
Mijangos. Thank you.
I have a question. Loved your talk. I hate to ask you a cultural question, but I'm interested in studying the Cult of Cristo Rey in the 1920s, and I find a lot of parallels within your time period of the cult of Sagrado Corazón de Jesus as kind of this cultural Catholic symbol of resistance during your period. And I was just wondering if you've noticed the same thing, or if I'm kind of reading tea leaves and misreading those tea leaves. Like, what do you think of that?
Should I answer one by one? Well, the Sagrado Corazón devotion is a Jesuit fostered devotion that actually became much stronger in the second half of the 19th century after the separation of church and state, like with the devotion to Saint Joseph, for instance. No? It became a very ultramontane symbol. But I think there is a really big difference between the time I'm exploring and the time you are exploring, because by the 1920s, 1930s, we are talking about the Vatican First Catholic Church, which was way more ultramontane, way more centralized than that of the 19th century. This period of the 19th century is really interesting because we come from a relative detachment of Rome from Spanish-American affairs during the colonial period to what Elisa Cárdenas has labeled the discovery of the Americas by Rome. And it was a painful, complicated process that lasted until the 1870s, more or less, Mexico being one of the most complicated cases. So during this period, there are some signs of ultramontanism, something that I think historians of Mexico need to explore. For instance, is the development of a local or a national ultramontane tradition without Rome or the Jesuits explicitly fostering it. But by the time you were studying, well, Rome and the Pio Latinos and all that generation, they had been fostering ultramontane devotions in all possible ways for decades, which also led to many conflicts in the Mexican church that Matthew has explored very well. You know, that's one of the reasons why you have this very interesting experiment of the Mexican Apostolic Church in the 1920s. No? This relatively national kind of Gallican church in the 20th century. No? So yeah, we are talking about a moment in which both Catholicism in general, Rome, the Catholic Church, the Mexican state, Mexican society are changing dramatically in a period of a century.
I kind of in a similar vein too. I was curious, are there any? I mean, this happened almost like two centuries ago, right? We're talking from like 1850s, 1870s. are there any lingering effects on how that has shaped contemporary Mexican politics, Mexican faith, or even just the relationship with Rome as well in the contemporary age?
Yeah, well, that's a broad question that goes way beyond what I'm treating here, but let me answer it very, very quickly. And I can talk about this from my personal experience. Mexico, when I grew up as a kid in the 1980s and 1990s, I attended Catholic school. And I grew up in a Catholic culture, a Catholic culture that was also kind of, I wouldn't use the term ultramontane for the late 20th century, but we all love the Pope. When Pope John Paul II visited Mexico like 5 times, it was like the big event for Catholics in my generation. But it was a very weird event because the Pope came as a sort of private visitor, to a almost clandestine, massive organization called the Catholic Church. Because there was not just separation of church and state. Until 1992, the Catholic Church did not even have legal personality. So, and then things changed in 1992 with the constitutional reform. So Mexico became more normalized. It became more similar to other countries in Spanish America. But I'm using quotation marks because even when you compare it to the rest of Spanish America, Mexico still has both things, a tradition of a rather independent kind of Catholicism, and a state that still wants to be or cast itself as secular, as laico. There was even this reform in the 2020, in the early 2000s, modifying the constitution to say that the Mexican Republic was laica. And I think that's a long-lasting legacy, from the 19th century. If you compare that experience with the rest of Spanish America, it's different. In other countries of Spanish America, even today, you see the imbricacies, of that old regime of state patronage or union of church and state. Patronage was still exercised by the Argentinian government until the 1960s. So I think this comparison was always present for Rome, and I think it should be present for analyzing Mexico. For instance, if you want to understand why there's no Cristero war in Peru or Bolivia or Argentina, is it because they were not as hardcore Catholics? I wouldn't say no, that's not the case, but probably the answer has to do with some of the long-term factors that Rome was already aware in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. The union of church and state, the collaboration of church and state remained much stronger in other countries with different degrees. There were moments of strong anti-clericalism, but not as extreme as the case of Mexico. Mexico it has a distinctive history in the Spanish American context.
Could you define the patronage question again?
Patronage is an old canonical institution by which the person or the institution who supports the foundation, the building of a church, has the right to appoint the person that will be in charge of that church. It's a medieval institution. And it was expanded in the 16th century to give the Spanish crown the power of government and administration of the church in the Americas, because the Spanish crown supported the evangelization of the Americas. So that meant that some of the main government decisions over the Catholic Church in the Americas for 3 centuries actually belonged to the Spanish crown. So the question that was really, really hard to solve after the 1820s was, what happens with patronage when there is no longer the Spanish crown? Because that had been a privilege granted by the Pope to the Spanish kings. So that became a question in all the Spanish America throughout the 19th century, where patronage rights something inherent to state sovereignty, were patronage rights something that only the Pope could grant? That was the discussion of concordats. That was a discussion all over the place that had major ramifications. It's like saying, let me make a comparison. Who has the power to appoint a governor? The King of England, the President of the United States, the Congress, or the people? In its practical relevance, it was as powerful as that. That's why all the governments in Spanish America were obsessed with the patronage question. We're trying to get the recognition of patronage, trying to sign a concordat or asserting it directly. And Rome was perfectly aware of the problem. And that's also why it's important not to use the brand Latin America. I will not quote the author, but a recent article in the American Historical Review makes this awful mistake. When we use Latin America and include Brazil and Haiti for analyzing these topics, we're missing some of the fine print. And for instance, Brazil did not have the patronage question because since it became independent with the heir of the Braganza family, well, patronage was not a problem.
It was a Portuguese colony.
Yeah, so patronage remained. The church had other problems and Rome was very aware of that, but it could not be confused with the situation of Spanish America. Haiti was also a different case because Haiti belonged to the French tradition. So for Rome, the Haitian reference was the Napoleonic Concordat of 1801. Rome analyzed the French case, not just in accordance to the problem of slavery, the poverty of Haiti and all that, but also analyzing the long-term consequences of the French model. So I think it's important to take seriously this Roma perspective because it allows us to see the peculiarities, the distinctive aspects about Spanish America, Mexico, and the different countries of the region.
Yeah, go Jose Roberto.
Thank you very much. This was very fascinating, and I commend you for introducing like a less isolated view of Mexican history. My question is how this perspective that the Holy See had to understand the region as Spanish America and to read, compare each of the new countries, how much did it carry over from the era of the Spanish Crown, Patronazgo, like from, I don't know, institutional knowledge, or how much was it more like independently from Rome itself? And also maybe how was it also maybe influenced by the current European view in general on Spanish America or Mexico? I don't know.
Okay, there are a couple of things there. First is how Rome constructed its image about Mexico, and this is a process that took decades because in the 1820s the available information about Mexico was actually reduced. Like if you go to the archives and look for what's the information we have about Mexico or Guatemala or Bolivia or Colombia or New Granada, it was minimal. Only the most important documents are perhaps the so-called relaciones diocesanas, the diocesan relations that bishops, according to the Council of Trent, had to send to Rome every number of years. But that information was very irregular. Many dioceses did not send those reports. Some of them send them every 20 years or more. So that was and also those reports sometimes were only like 7 pages or 10 pages long, so they were not full of details. It would vary dramatically from diocese to diocese. Rome had intervened in some Spanish American issues before independence, but only as a sort of court of appeals, let me put it in that way. In some issues that required the Roman intervention because there were matters of conscience involved, or things that were not covered by the Spanish patronage, then Rome would intervene. those were a reduced number of issues. If you want to know about the Spanish American churches, like the big information, the big picture, it's better to look at the Spanish sources. Then you have independence. And this is what Elisa Cárdenas describes as the discovery of the Americas by Rome. That discovery took some decades. From reading, the dossiers of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, not just about Mexico, but about all the Spanish American countries, I can say that the Holy See had already had a relatively complete picture by the late 1830s. I think the image that Rome had by the late 1830s remained constant at least till the 1870s. The people who worked for the congregation during those years would be, the people in charge of the congregation at the times of Pius the Ninth. And that image was crafted looking at all the cases simultaneously. So that's the interesting part of all this. They never saw like, oh, this is Mexico. No. It's Mexico along with Guatemala, along with Colombia, along with all of the America Española. Then the other part was
how did compare to other views on this region in Europe?
In Europe, that's a very interesting question. From what I know, the other chancelleries in Europe, especially those that had some influence in Rome, like Spain and Austria and France, they had changing views on Spanish America. Spain tried to influence and to shape the Roman view on Spanish America, at least until 1833, because Ferdinand VII was adamant at not recognizing the independence of Spanish America. So the nuncio of Spain in Rome, he even threatened to break relations with Rome before 1833, because it said, no, those are colonies, those are not independent territories, they should not have it's the king who should appoint the bishops there, etc., etc. But they failed to persuade the Roman Curia. Then, after 1833, Spain took a more moderate vision about the Spanish America. More pragmatic, more interested in business or international relations, more secular, so to speak. The same with France. Austria was not so involved in Spanish American affairs by the late 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. No? So very much the view of Rome was shaped essentially by the information it got from Rome, from bishops, informants, delegates, governments. And there was also a network, a very informal network of people connected with Rome by family ties, business ties, people related to the Roman aristocracy, etc., that actually had a very deep influence. And there were also some people, Maddalena Burelli, who has studied this very well. She has a fascinating article on one guy, one Italian priest, who actually spent like 20 years in Mexico, saying that he was a protonotario apostolico. But just a liar, like saying, I have an appointment from the Pope, and he even, interviewed presidents and the Archbishop, and Rome only discovered this guy in 1851. So we must also be aware of the problems of communication there. So for Rome, it was very hard to know what was going on the ground. So that's why trusting or not trusting people was so important. If Rome said, this bishop is a bad bishop because he's just sold to the government, that is so corrupt and has 3 women and whatever, they could not trust what they were saying. If they were saying, this bishop is so great, so loyal to Rome, or this president is so ultramontane, they would fully trust them. So it's a very interesting, very complex diplomatic game they are playing.
I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One is about the tradition about liberalism, Catholicism in Mexico. You talked about the Gómez Farías government. There have been people like Fray Servando before. So, what lessons does Rome take from the fact that those people are defeated, like, or they come and go? That when it comes to the Reform in the middle of the 19th century, is Rome thinking, if we hang tough, this goes away and we defeat it, and that helps to explain partly. It is Rome's reading of Mexican history, is a factor. And then the other thing, I was trying, as you were kind of establishing your list of commonalities between Mexico and Spanish American countries, I was trying to think of things that might still be exceptional. And one of the things that is exceptional about Mexico is it has a 1,000-mile border with the United States, and there's been a war very recently. And some people now interpret that war as a kind of religious war, like Peter Guardino. So does that factor into Rome's thinking about Mexico as well? Like, is this already a front line? This is something that we must defend, or how do you see that aspect of it?
Yeah, I'm going to tell things from the Roman perspective. Regarding liberalism, they don't use that label frequently. They usually refer to secular politicians, the secular government. They refer to governments in general, to the secular arm, because for them the party problems in Mexico, they are subsumed in the intrinsic weakness of the republican system. So they have like this ultra-reactionary view shaped by European events, which is that's why they become pals with Gutierrez de Estrada from the beginning, because they say, well, the problem is the republic per se, it's democracy. So who cares, the labels they are using? Sometimes with some politicians they may use epithets that say this guy is anti-Catholic, atheist, revolutionary. This is the worst for people like Gómez Farías, or later Ocampo, or Juárez. But they don't have a very nuanced understanding, of the different liberal traditions, or even conservative. So they may use, for instance, the expression the conservative elements of society, not the party, conservative elements. And so there is always a very negative view about that. Something that I still have to find more information about this is about the liberal clergy, because they always say that most of the clergy is very loyal, most of the clergy is great, which means that there is a sector that is not that loyal or not that great. But the reports for the delegates or the congregation are not very explicit about that issue. I would need to explore those of the 1870s onward, but I have not seen them. I don't know if I will have life to do that. And the other thing about the border and the US, yes, it's a factor that appears in some of those documents, not as an issue that was already a danger, but as a potential danger in the future. First of all, Rome was more preoccupied about the actual governance of those territories, like Texas, like California. Like, what are we going to do with the 10 Catholics that remain in Texas? So Rome did not take very seriously any attempt of the Mexican government to say that, oh, Texas still belongs to Mexico. Rome said, like, no way, no. We care about the Catholics there, and you lost. Also with the case of California. But at the same time, they say, well, the US is a Protestant country. And the US is also a fascinating story here, because Rome, on the one hand, Rome back then, and I would even say even today, so even with an American Pope there, has always had like a sort of a schizophrenic view about the US. Because on the one hand, the US is kind of the Protestant country by definition. Rome, because of that Protestant character, fell under the jurisdiction of the Congregation for Propaganda Fide. It was a territory of mission, like an African colony or an Asian colony. And at the same time, Rome was the fastest growing church in the Americas. It had more dioceses, parishes, convents, schools than any Spanish American republic. So Rome did not know what to do about it, how to understand, the peculiarities of the US. And when discussing the US, Rome always said, that's the US, it's not the rest of the Americas. So yeah, it's a very complex issue there.
Well, if there are no more questions, then let us all thank Pablo Mijangos once again for this wonderful session.